The Wars of the Roses were among the most interesting and important conflicts England would ever fight during the Middle Ages, with roots dating back centuries and an impact that would reverberate throughout England for many years. Filled with mighty battles, dynastic squabbles, Machiavellian political manoeuvring and grisly bloodbaths, they would inspire epic tales ranging from Shakespeare to Game of Thrones. This story, however, starts in 1422, when England was at the apex of its power during the 100 Years' War, charging forwards, oblivious to the calamities it would soon endure. Our story starts with a death. For the previous 9 years, King Henry V had laid waste to France and her armies, winning a staggering victory at Agincourt and conquering most of the northern regions. He was joined by the powerful Burgundians in 1420 and was declared as the heir to the French throne that year, as dictated by the Treaty of Troyes. He married the mad French king's daughter Catherine, and he had a son, also named Henry, soon after. Literally nothing could stop him now. And then he died. Regardless of whether it was dysentery or heatstroke to slay the young king, the result was the same. Stripped of their finest leader, this would be the first in a series of unfortunate events which would spell the end for the English Empire in France, and the beginning of the Wars of the Roses. Henry's son, the newly crowned Henry VI, was an infant of less than a year. A regency would have to be established, therefore. The matter was complicated further when Charles VI died, and his son, also called Charles, claimed the French throne. According to the Treaty of Troyes, Henry VI was now the French king, although the English were faced with a gruelling slog if they wanted to stamp his control over the entirety of the nation. The elder Charles was quite literally insane, whereas this younger one was vigorous and active, a stark contrast to the gargling baby who was supposedly the king of two nations. Henry V had enough foresight to see this train wreck moving towards him. Shortly before his death, Henry had dictated his plans for a regency council for his son. John Bedford, his eldest brother, was to oversee the affairs in France, while Humphrey, the Duke of Gloucester, and his youngest brother was to be given the title of tutelar for the young king. Tutelar essentially means guardian, but Humphrey interpreted it to give him sweeping powers and paramount authority in England. Humphrey himself was popular, cultured and intelligent, but he was also brash and temperamental, with no small sense of self. Many would have welcomed his rule, but Bedford was not having it. Humphrey was made the protector and defender of the Kingdom of England, and the English Church and the principal counsellor of the Lord King. This title sounded fancy, but in reality it only made him the preeminent man among a ruling council, and he would have to defer power to Bedford whenever he returned to England. Humphrey acted with a fair amount of grace in the face of this snub from Bedford, and saw that England stood on a dangerous precipice that could see them totally collapse if they weren't careful enough, showing how, despite their differences, the English nobles were generally able to hold it together for the greater good, at least in the beginning. This did not mean that council rule was a complete success. In 1425, conflicts flared up between Humphrey and Henry Beaufort, the king's uncle, Bishop of Winchester, and the Chancellor of England. They often held opposing opinions, resulting in mutual mistrust and animosity. This specific quarrel erupted chiefly due to Humphrey's abortive expedition to Holland, with the aim of pressing his wife's claims to lands there. There were two problems with this plan. Firstly, it was a failure, and secondly, the man who currently held these lands was supported by the Burgundians, England's most powerful ally in France. This also caused riots against the Flemish in London, riots which Beaufort had to quell. This made him seem like an enemy of the English who gave preferential treatment to foreigners, not a combination for popularity in medieval England. Blood was nearly spilled as Beaufort prepared to attack London to stop Gloucester, but frantic negotiations saved the day and Bedford soon returned to restore order. Beaufort was soon called on by the Pope to lead a crusade in Europe. This was not a win for Humphrey though, as council rule was firmly enforced by Bedford, with both men promising not to seek greater power. This notwithstanding, Humphrey demanded greater authority in the following year before being firmly told to beat it and go home. Meanwhile in France, things initially seemed to be going Bedford's way, with him winning a major victory through sheer grit and determination, despite being outnumbered 2-1. Bedford possessed many kingly qualities: intelligent, a seasoned warrior, just in rule, and physically imposing. His selection as ruler in France was obvious, yet the titanic task which Bedford faced would always frustrate the man, as Charles VII's very existence held an alternative political gravity which consistently eroded the legitimacy of the English presence, while resistance was still strong in the south. The English also ran a determined propaganda campaign in an attempt to legitimise the English conquest of France. Here is an example of the type of family tree published by the authorities to persuade the people that Henry VI's claims came through his blood, not through brutish conquest. although all of the English claims were technically invalid by the fact that women were not part of succession according to ancient French Salic law. They wouldn't let themselves get bogged down by that though. Bedford still achieved some degree of success, and Charles had been driven past the Loire River by 1428. That same year would also see the beginning of the Siege of Orléans, the town where English fortunes in France would begin to unravel under renewed French pressure. The English leader was killed by stray debris, dismaying the already tired besiegers, before a relief effort led partially by Joan of Arc was launched. Joan's zealous courage inspired the defenders and was instrumental to the French victory. Orléans was only the beginning in a large French counterattack. Town after town was recaptured, and by mid-1429 Charles was anointed at Rheims. In response to this loss of prestige and authority, Henry was crowned at Westminster in 1429 and once again as King of France in 1431. The English presence in France only disintegrated further as the years rolled on. 1435 saw two more nails in the English coffin. First came the embarrassing Conference of Arras, which saw the reconciliation of Charles and the Burgundians, robbing England of a most powerful ally, and then Bedford died at the age of 46. His loss would only serve to exacerbate the cracks among the English aristocracy and would hasten the French victory in the war. This was perhaps the time for Henry to step up to the block and take command of the situation, and the council did try to push him towards self-rule, but if it was a warrior king like his father that England hoped for, Henry VI would be an unmitigated disappointment. Henry VI was kind, humble and pious, but indecisive, weak and almost totally unable to rule. All this would make this new man no more of a king than the gargling baby we started this episode with. This would always leave a vacuum at the heart of power, and this would be filled by the influential William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, who gained immense control over the government and of the king himself. Humphrey would soon be cast into political ignominy when his second wife was found guilty of witchcraft after trying to predict Henry VI's death, as Humphrey was the current heir. This left Cardinal Beaufort in an advantageous position, although his first attempts to throw around this new power would end in near total failure. This came in the form of a campaign in the attempts to conquer the regions around Maine, an uncharacteristically aggressive move for Beaufort, who was usually more cautious when approaching military matters. The campaign, led by his nephew the Earl of Somerset, was a complete failure and pissed off Richard, Duke of York, who had succeeded Bedford as the commander in France, as it undercut his authority. William, Earl of Suffolk, saw the utter state the war effort was in and travelled to France in 1444 to negotiate a temporary truce in exchange for Henry's marriage to Margaret of Anjou, niece of Charles VII. They were married with much celebration in London next year. England hoped that this truce could lead to further peace talks, but the French refused to allow them to hold any French land with full sovereignty unless they bent the knee to the French king. Talks resumed and the French offered Henry a deal. Surrender Maine and they would have peace for 20 years. Why they ever accepted this deal is beyond me, and to say that it was unpopular is an understatement. Much blood had been spilt over Maine, and every noble connected to the deal came under fire. This could present an opportunity to Humphrey, whose implacably aggressive opinions on the war with France were well known, to leap back into the saddle and oppose Suffolk's more peaceful faction. Suffolk was not blind to this possibility and summoned Humphrey to Parliament in 1447, with the secret aim of discrediting and silencing the Duke of Gloucester. Humphrey saw the danger he was in and brought a retinue of a few hundred armed Welshmen. He arrived and was immediately placed under house arrest on the 20th of February. He died on the 23rd, most likely of a stroke. This is where we will leave the story for now. Next time we will watch as the 100 Years' War is concluded and as Suffolk suffers a sudden and bloody fall from grace. If you do like these videos, then make sure to subscribe, as I hope to get one video up every Sunday, although that could be subject to change.